The judiciary, judges. They had a Supreme Court in Ohio, but the Supreme Court and justices in Ohio were not appointed by the governor or by Congress. They were elected by the General Assembly. That is, elected by the people representing the people. And they had not lifetime tenure, but they were elected for 7 years. 7 years. Why? Because the men who resented the power of the territorial government, who said that the Northwest Territory was a violation of the American Revolution, did not want a part of the government to have enormous power. So they said, in a republic, this is negotiating, I'm talking about, in a republic, judges must be as responsive to the people as any other part of government. Therefore, 7-year terms, and they are elected. Today in Ohio, judges have limited terms, and they are elected popularly by the people. Why? Because of Arthur Sinclair. Not because just some random idea that came up, but because of the idea that people should have the right to choose their own form of government. You know that, for example, today in the conservative movement in the United States, judges, their appointment of judges is a huge issue. And you listen to talk radio and they're quoting Thomas Jefferson all the time about judges because he hated the idea that judges were appointed. Judges of the Supreme Court and federal judges are appointed for life because of the idea I explained earlier that people shouldn't be trusted with government all the time, because they're too impulsive. So you need sort of people to stand back and above and make decisions down the line. Cool things off. Not in Ohio, however. In Ohio, you have democratically elected governors. So the judges then in Ohio are more responsive to the people than anywhere else in the United States. Democratically elected justices, weak governor, and a very powerful legislature, all designed essentially to ensure a Republican form of government. The Indians are no longer a problem. What do you do with regard to slavery? You repass the notion that slavery is forbidden in Ohio, but the other thing the General Assembly does is to say, create what are called black codes. And the black codes, which are created in the first General Assembly, say that black people basically are not welcome in Ohio. In order to come to Ohio as a free black man, you had to post a bail of $500, which would be the equivalent today of posting a bond of about $500,000. And you had to register with the local sheriff, and you could be escorted out at any particular time. This did not go as far as the Indiana State Legislature in 1850, which said any black man found in Indiana without permission could be shot on the spot. The black population of Ohio is under 1% and remains so until the end of the 19th century because it was simply not a place where black people were welcome. So the state government of Ohio then is not simply sort of this random thing that happens. It's not something that happens just for Ohio. The major things I want you to take out of this today are that it happens in a historical context, that it is part of a larger national, even international debate about republics. What is a republic? And how should that republic function? And that government itself is defined through that negotiation. So there is never any permanent sense of what the government is all about. Everybody accepts in Ohio that it should be Republican. Everybody accepts certain degrees of liberty. Everybody accepts that government has certain responsibilities. But how those get worked out on a day-to-day basis, on an issue-by-issue basis, change all the time. Now, you're not going to remember any of this 5 years from now or 5 minutes from now. But one of the things I hope you do remember is that when you watch television and listen to the news today and you have all these commentators get on and say, the world's coming to an end or this is the beginning of what you see happening, in my opinion, is the continued negotiation of the meaning of a democratic republic. We are constantly debating the boundaries and the borders of local control versus national control, taxes, and how much to spend. Every issue, every day, those things come up. And while you have people on the extremes, as you did in the 1790s, the vast majority of people are somewhere in the middle, just hoping a government will exist that will provide them with legitimacy and give them some kind of honest voice. If you approach history, in other words, not as cut and dried, all is defined, it's a bunch of facts that you have to memorize, but instead approach it as an unfolding process, as a story in which the people themselves didn't know the ending, had no idea what was going to happen, it becomes much more interesting, much more exciting, a lot more fun, and a lot more significant in terms of thinking about your own life and your own republic and the future of both your state and your country. Now, does anybody have any questions or anything you want to argue with me about over the course of the last 2.5 days I've been talking to you? It must feel like out there. Yes, sir.
Was the argument against Arthur St. Clair's government that Arthur St. Clair himself was so bad, or the government was just a lot more controlling than these people wanted?
I think Sinclair was incompetent in some ways. He tended to drink too much, but he became a symbol of the idea that government was inefficient because it was trying to do too much. In other words, they were related to each other. Yes, ma'am?
Why haven't the people fought back against St. Clair?
Earlier?
Yeah, earlier, instead of waiting for government.
Well, three reasons. One, because there weren't very many of them before Greenville. There were very few people who moved into Ohio because they were scared of Indians. Second thing was that really the Indians had to be defeated. And that was the major thing the national government did. And the third and final thing you need was, since the territory was run by the national government, you had to change the national government before you could change the Northwest Territory. In other words, it was a completely undemocratic system. So until you had a president and a Congress who were willing to say to Sinclair, get out and shut up, he could continue to do whatever he wanted to do. Yes?
How did other states in the Northwest Territory after Ohio, what did their governments look like compared?
They tended to emulate Ohio's, mostly because Ohio was settled largely, its early leaders were Virginians and Kentuckians. The southern states in the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, have much more legislative-centered governments. Those states that were settled a little bit later and by more people from New England, Yankees, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, they tend to have more powerful judges and more powerful governors. The same kind of blue state, red state thing you see today. And so Michigan and Wisconsin tended to have constitutions that put more power into the judges and the governors than the southern states did. Yeah?
Backtracking a little bit, I read somewhere that the United States made a lot of treaties with the Indians, but they didn't keep any of them. Why? I don't know why did they not see the importance of that?
Well, actually, a lot of people did see the importance of it. The problem was that the territorial government, the Washington administration, basically, the administration of President Washington in the 1790s, had the power to defeat the Indians, but it didn't have enough power to keep its own citizens from pouring across the borders that it had established. So I think in Greenville in '95, the representatives of the Washington administration in good faith signed a treaty and said, here's the line, and we're going to stay south of the line. But 4,000 men versus hundreds of thousands of people who see land and won it. There was no way that they could keep Americans within those boundaries. So in effect, you're right. Every treaty signed with the Indians, the Americans end up violating. But you got to separate out here a little bit intentions and consequences. And because all the treaties were violated, it doesn't necessarily follow that all the men who signed the treaties did so cynically. That is, they thought that they should be able to honor those treaties, and then when actual practice came about, they were unable to do so. One of the things you need to understand is that Washington, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, and Sinclair tended to see Indians and white settlers as pretty much the same thing. That is, people who were irrational and incapable of making intelligent decisions. So they saw their job as restraining whites as well as Indians. They failed with the whites. Yeah.
After the Greenville Treaty, did any Native Americans remain in Ohio?
Did any of them what? Sorry?
Indians.
Did they end up doing what?
Did they remain in Ohio?
Well, there are some. Not as many as remained in Indiana. There weren't as many of them actually living in Ohio. Most of them left. Most of them were removed, actually, in the 1820s and the 1830s. And the major remnants you see today of American Indians in Ohio, besides the Indian mounds and the landscapes, are in the names of universities, which have co-opted their names and call themselves Miami University.